Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second live lesson number 3. And tonight we're going to explore the topic of stress a little bit further. After we talked last week about 2 specific parts of the human brain. Hi, Nikki. Hi, Hems. Hi, Sharon. Nice to see you. So we talked about these 2 parts of the brain that are responsible for A, keeping us safe and alive, and B, enabling us to maintain positive mental health, and then in effect to thrive. So while we're waiting for others to arrive, I just thought that I'd reiterate for those of you who are joining us for the first time or watching this on replay, the reasons why we set this group up. So having all been told to stay home, and if we do go out for food or health reasons or essential work, to remain 2 meters away from other people, the reality is that for many of us, those regular activities, whether they're leisure or social activities, and specifically the ones that enable us to keep in positive mental health, have not been available to us in quite the same way as they were before, if at all. And although that may change for some of us from Wednesday, if we do decide to make use of the more relaxed rules around leisure activities, you know, that has been a real challenge for many of us. And we've all had to really adapt very quickly to different ways of keeping in touch with people, some very unfamiliar methods of working. And because our brain interprets all change without exception initially as a threat, for some of us, inevitably, this would have had an impact on our mental well-being and in effect on our emotional and physiological and psychological resilience. And when our resilience is low, our ability to maintain our motivation and our focus, and in effect, our ability to survive adversity, or more specifically right now, a pandemic, can become compromised. And so that's why we set this group up, to provide the information, the tools, and really importantly, the confidence, and that's the feedback we're getting actually, the confidence to enable us all to better manage our own mental well-being and that of those that we live with and work with, during which is a particularly challenging time. And one of the most empowering ways of doing that is understanding stress better, because when we understand something, we are much more equipped to deal with it. And that's what we're going to be exploring a little bit more this evening. So before we proceed, it might not surprise you that I'm going to ask you just to type into the comments here something that's been good in the last week. And just like every week, just like every time, it can be absolutely anything at all. So it doesn't need to be something big. It can be something very small, because there's always something that's been good, even if it's just a small something. And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to see who else has joined us. Hi, Simon. Hello, Jay. Nice to see you. Becky, Chaz, nice to see you here. Hello, Anna. Oh, Chaz, you're on time this week. Well done. Lovely to see you all. And hi, Beryl. Good to see you all here. So what's been good for me? Well, yesterday, having become very aware that I've not been very great this week at intentionally enabling my brain to switch off from work, I very intentionally picked up a paintbrush yesterday and spent the vast majority of it painting our chrome radiator in our bathroom a gorgeous dark teal colour. So apart from the dark teal making me smile, and anyone who knows me knows that that would be the case, I did it for a number of reasons. So firstly, I've wanted to do it for weeks and it was frustrating me that it wasn't getting done. But perhaps more importantly, because I know that something like that will give my brain a rest, allowing it to stop thinking and planning, which is what it's doing a lot of at the moment, and instead to slow down, to access a different state of consciousness. So a state of consciousness that will allow my brain to process any concerns or challenges and problem solve in a much more gentle way than when we're trying to do that over cognitively. And we're going to learn a little bit more about this different kind of altered state of awareness this evening. The result was that we have a lovely new radiator, but more importantly than that, I experienced a wonderful hit of the reward hormone dopamine. And we're going to explore happy hormones in a bit more detail next week. I also had some realizations and made some decisions subconsciously without any effort at all. And I also noticed a significant difference in my sleep last night as a result. So that's my what's been good. Tell us below, tell us yours so that we can share Oh, we had a street party. That's brilliant, Sharon. We didn't have any here, which was really interesting. Nikki, getting out on your bike for the first time in ages. Yeah, Simon and I are thinking about buying bikes. Sleeping out under the stars with the kids. That's awesome. Sorting boxes in the loft. Long overdue and bizarrely satisfying. Well, that's dopamine as well, and you'll understand a bit more, Anna, next week why that is. So you might remember that there are 2 reasons why I ask you to share something that's been good. And tonight I'm going to share a little bit more about that, but we're going to talk about stress. So we're going to talk a bit more about stress. And you'll recall me talking last week about these 2 parts of the human brain that play a role in keeping us alive, and that's the primitive brain, and enable us to thrive, and that's the intellectual brain. And I explained that when we operate from the intellectual brain, which sits here at the front of our skull in the prefrontal cortex, we generally get things right in life. And that's because this is our rational and logical part. So this is the part that we are using when we are aware of our interactions together. It's also the part that stores all of our experiences that we've ever had, and all of the knowledge and skills that we've developed over time as a result of those experiences, so that we can access it when we need to help us make decisions, to be creative and inventive, and really importantly, to come up with solutions. When we operate from this part of our brain, we approach any situation positively, and we will always come up with solutions based on a proper assessment of that situation. However, when we operate from our primitive brain, which sits towards the back of our skull, and this is the original part of the brain, so the part that existed way before the intellectual part of the brain ever developed, we behave in a way that's designed simply to keep us safe, because this part of the brain is only concerned with one thing, and that is survival. It's not interested in enabling us to be the very best version of ourselves or to thrive in our lives. It's interested in one thing and one thing only, and that is self-preservation. So when we encounter a situation that we perceive as threatening, our brain, if you remember from last week, triggers our fight or flight response in our amygdala. Our hippocampus then looks at previous patterns of behavior that have enabled us to survive in the past, and it responds appropriately with those. And our hypothalamus then floods our system with the stress hormones we need, namely cortisol, which increases our heart rate and blood pressure, tenses our muscles, ready for anything. And this is a state that we recognize when we sense any feeling of anxiety. Now, what happens is this response increases the cortisol in our system by 500%. And that cortisol takes between 2 and 3 days to leave our system. It completely depletes our serotonin, which is a lovely hormone that governs happiness, and it fogs our brain, so it becomes much more difficult for us to access the information in this wonderful library of resources that we really need access to if we're going to be operating in a positively mental way. So suddenly, simple things like remembering someone's name or what was discussed in a meeting becomes a real challenge. Now, whilst this response is entirely appropriate when we are in genuine danger, it isn't always helpful when what we're worrying about is a work meeting or a conversation or something that we need to get done. So tonight we want to talk about how we create this anxiety, which causes us to move very rapidly, actually, from the intellectual, rational, logical, sensible part of our brain down to the primitive part, whose job is to keep us safe. And quite simply, and this might surprise you, anxiety is caused by negative thinking. Now, it may interest you to know that the average person has around 100,000 thoughts every single day. Now, I don't know how they measured that, but it's a relatively well-known scientific fact. Now, that's about 1 thought every single second. That's a lot of thoughts, and most of them are not experienced consciously, which is just as well, because we'd be exhausted. Now, what's even more interesting is that a large number of these thoughts are negative and unhelpful. So let's just think about this for a minute. Even if just half of the thoughts that we have daily are negative, that's a staggering 50,000 negative thoughts every single day. Now, negative thoughts can be about ourselves, or they can be about life in general. They can be big things, or they can be very, very little things. Regardless of what they're about, though, every negative thought that we have is converted literally into anxiety. When we worry about a situation, we are literally making a judgment about it. We are judging it as bad, and our judgment isn't always correct. The reality is it's not the events in our lives that necessarily cause the perception of crisis. It's the thought patterns surrounding the events in our life that do that. Anxiety or stress is not the result of our work or our boss or our family or our finances. It isn't the result of any circumstance that we're in, including, dare I say, a pandemic. Anxiety is the result of the thoughts that we have in relation to those things. And here we need to remember what we talked about last week, which was that the mind can't tell the difference between imagination and reality. So every time we worry about something that hasn't happened yet, our brain thinks it's happening. So if we worry about an event that hasn't happened yet, say 20 times, our brain thinks we've actually experienced that event 20 times. And it's exactly the same when we go back over past events as well, worrying about things that have already happened. These are all experienced by the brain as if they are real. And so the body responds as if it were real too. So it gives us this anxiety and all the symptoms that go with that. So it increases our heart rate, our palms get sweaty, our stomach starts to churn. Now, this isn't helpful because generally, no matter how much we worry about these future events, we tend to survive them. And no matter how much we think about the past, we are generally safe here in the present. So why is our brain doing this? Why is it responding to our thoughts in this way? For a very good reason, and that is to keep us safe. But unfortunately, our brain doesn't understand the modern world, and it mistakes the stresses of everyday life for dangerous situations. And without understanding how our brain works, we respond automatically by default on autopilot accordingly with worrying and negative thoughts. And this is the thing, every one of those negative thoughts gets accumulated and it gets stored in our metaphorical stress bucket. So I just want you to imagine a bucket right now and imagine that when we worry about something 20 times, it goes into the stress bucket 20 times as 20 different events. And inevitably, our stress bucket fills up rather quickly. And eventually, there's no room left in the bucket for new negative thoughts to go in. And so naturally, if you fill a bucket with anything, eventually it starts to overflow. And when it does overflow, we drop from our intellectual, sensible part of our brain, so the part that knows what to do and when to do it, down to that primitive fight or flight part, the part that is solely concerned with self-preservation. Now, the bad news here is that the average emotional age of the primitive part of our brain is about 4 to 5 years old. And whilst 4 to 5 years olds are very, very cute, when faced with a challenge, let's be honest, they're far more likely to have a tantrum because they don't have the intellectual capacity that we do as adults, than come up with an intelligent suggestion. And that's not always the case, but you understand where I'm coming from. Now, the good news is that we have far more influence over this process than we think when we understand how the brain works. And there are two things that we need to do to reduce negative thoughts and the negative feelings associated with stress and increase positive feelings. So the first thing we need to do is empty the already overflowing stress bucket. Because if our stress bucket level is low, then it doesn't matter what life throws at us. We function from our intellectual brain, where we can make a rational assessment of the situation. And we can call on all of our resources and skills to help us cope with, or even better, deal with it. It's only when our bucket overflows that we end up down in the primitive part of our brain. So how do we do it? How do we empty our stress bucket? Thankfully, we already have a method of doing this. And it might surprise you to find that that method is very simply called sleep. When we sleep, or should I say when we sleep properly, our sleep consists of two stages. Now, about 20% of our sleep is our REM sleep. So that's otherwise known as rapid eye movement sleep. And this part of our sleep, its job is to empty our stress buckets and restore our minds. And then the second stage is 80% slow wave sleep. So this is restorative sleep. Its job is literally to restore our bodies. It's much, much deeper. Now, when we are in our REM stage of sleep, our brain literally reruns the events of the day that have ended up in our stress buckets. And that's the real events and the imagined ones too. And it processes them. And this is why REM is also often referred to as the dream state, because sometimes we can be aware that we're in REM when we dream. Now, REM is designed specifically to deal with stress. And you might know how this works already. You know, a work colleague does something at work that really annoys you during the day, and you find that you're going over and over and over it in your mind all day long. And later on, over dinner with your partner, or perhaps on the phone to a friend, you're telling them all about it, and they agree with you that it was really annoying. You talk it over some more, and when you go to bed, what happened is still going around in your head. You can't believe they did what they did or said what they said, and you're having conversations with them in your mind, perhaps obsessing about how unfair it was, or annoying it was, or how cheeky it was. And when you go to sleep, you will rerun that event in your REM sleep, and your REM sleep will process it, because that's its job. When you wake up in the morning, you will either have forgotten about the event completely, or you'll be able to rationalize it and be left wondering why you ever let yourself get so annoyed about it in the first place. Now, if you can relate to that, and most of us have had that experience, what's happened is that the rerunning process has literally stripped the emotion from that event, and it's turned it into a useful narrative memory that's now stored in your library of resources in your intellectual brain for you to reference in the future. That's how it works when our stress bucket isn't overflowing. But when it is overflowing, this process is significantly impeded. And so instead of waking up with that event fully processed, the emotions stripped out of it, we wake up instead with it perhaps semi-processed or completely unprocessed. And sometimes we wake up mid-process, and you'll recognize that if you wake up at 2 or 3 or 4 a.m. without any explanation as to why. And that's because our stress bucket is full, and it's simply not possible for us to empty it in the 20% allocated for REM. So we wake up feeling exhausted. And that's because REM sleep is actually really hard work. When we are in REM, our brain is working literally 4 times harder than it does in a conscious waking state. So getting our sleep patterns right so that we have both ample duration and quality of sleep is really important when it comes to managing the levels in our stress bucket. Because when we do that, we enable ourselves to stay functioning from our intellectual mind. Now, in this modern day and age, there are lots and lots of triggers to stress that are not necessarily genuine threats to our safety. And I know that that isn't necessarily the case at the moment, but it won't just be the current situation that we find ourselves in that's creating a full stress bucket. There are lots of other things that are going in our stress bucket all the time. And these triggers are often referred to as stressors. And I find it can be really useful to have some conscious awareness of what stressors we have specifically that might be ending up in our stress bucket. So this is something that I'm going to suggest for you to do tonight, or this is my suggestion for tonight, you don't have to do it tonight, is to list everything that is a stressor for you so that you have sight of it on paper. If nothing else, it will focus your brain on what it needs to process when you go to sleep tonight, or the night that you do this exercise. So that's when the stress bucket is full. How do we empty it? So the good news is, again, there's a very easy and fast way of replicating this REM state. So we can actually replicate this, and that's a state of trance. Now, trance is still very misunderstood. Trance is actually a very natural state of altered consciousness that occurs when our brainwave frequency slows down. And this happens to us a lot during the day anyway. And when our brainwave frequency slows down and the prefrontal cortex in our brain, so our intellectual brain, becomes deactivated, When this happens, the brain goes about processing events and feelings in the same way as it does when it's in REM sleep. So if you were here right at the beginning, you'll recall that I was sharing my what's been good from this week, and I talked about spending the whole day yesterday painting my bathroom radiator. And I described this state of mind that I was very intentionally seeking to access. It's very similar to trance and very similar to the state of REM. So if you want to know how this works for yourself, you can download an MP3 audio on our website, which will lead you through this process to enable your brain to access this state with relative ease. And I'm going to post the link a little bit later on this evening. Listening to this audio before you go to sleep, not just tonight, but each night for a minimum of 7 days is what we recommend, will help you to get that 80-20 ratio right of sleep and enable you to empty your stress bucket, but not at the expense of the physical restorative sleep you need, which is what happens when our stress bucket's full and we may wake up mid-process, or we wake up the following morning feeling exhausted because we've over-REM'd, if you like. The great thing about this recording is it will also start to build your confidence in the skills and resources that you already have available to you in your intellectual mind, which will enable you to make the right decisions. And this becomes impeded when our stress buckets are full. So all you need to do is simply find somewhere comfortable to sit or lie down, click on the link, press play. Don't worry if you don't hear all of it, it still does its job. And in addition to that, our associates at Inspired to Change are also hosting live relaxation sessions. So essentially the same process every single day through lockdown in the week. So one's at 8:30 a.m, one's at 8:30 p.m, and then there's a lunchtime one as well for children, if you think this is something that would help your children. These are on their individual pages, and I have put a graphic in the group for you to access those as well. Do try it. If it feels like something a bit strange, give it a go, because you'll be surprised. Hopefully the science behind why we would do it will help you to give that a go. So emptying the stress bucket is absolutely essential, but we can also do lots of things to stop filling it up so much in the first place, because that's really where we want to get to. And the combination of doing both things together ensures that we get rid of any backlog, lowering the stress bucket levels on a permanent basis. And remember, when our stress bucket level is low, it doesn't matter what gets thrown at us during the day or during the week, because we have the capacity to deal with it from the intellectual part of our brain, where we have access to all of our resources, all of our experiences, all of our skills. And this is the bit where I introduce you to our DOSE model. So DOSE, D-O-S-E, stands for dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And these are the quartet of happy hormones that work together to combat cortisol. And it's the subject of next week's live, and it's the one that I'm most excited to share with you, because it's the basis of why we set this group up, a happy dose to enhanced resilience. So we are going to explore what happy hormones are. Firstly, we're going to explore their origin, where they came from, and what their benefits are. And then I'm going to introduce you to the model, the DOSE model, which is the basis of everything that this group is designed to enable us to do, which is to create very intentionally much more positive and consistent mental well-being. So you're going to leave with a greater appreciation of happy hormones, technically neurotransmitters, and an increased awareness and insight into your levels of 4 specific ones. So please pop the date and time into your diary. It will be the 18th of May at 7:30. If you haven't already, please turn on notifications for this group so that you are alerted automatically when this page goes live. Really looking forward to seeing you then. Can't wait to share this content with you. If for any reason you can't make it, the recording will be available on here soon after. Do get involved in the group. Let us know how you're getting on. Remember to share your what's been goods every day, and have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Lots of love to all. Bye-bye.